Bem-vindos a mais uma conversa Nós e a Ciência, da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, uma parceria com a editora Desassossego. Hoje falamos com Carl Zimmer a propósito do lançamento do seu Um Planeta de Vírus. Primeiro editado em 2011, foi agora revisto e acrescentado com o que sabemos de Covid-19 e oportunamente traduzido para português. É um livro que nos leva pela história do conhecimento humano sobre vírus, desde termos conseguido vacinas ainda sem sabermos o mal que nos afligia, a sermos capazes de sequenciar o seu genoma para melhor compreender e lutar contra uma criatura que fez parar o planeta. Este livro, de leitura cativante, vai-nos fazendo saber informação científica ao mesmo tempo que nos dá a conhecer os protagonistas, com narrativas tão detalhadas que nos faz ir com o autor desde cavernas a glaciares, do fundo do mar à superfície de placas de Petri, de pulmões de pessoas normais a apêndices em cabeças de coelhos, entrando pelos laboratórios melhor apetrechados do planeta, defendendo, já iremos perceber porquê, que este é um planeta de vírus. O seu autor, Carl Zimmer, traz-nos desde há muitos anos histórias das fronteiras da biologia, permitindo-nos espreitar por sítios onde a compreensão humana sobre a vida e o seu funcionamento está a ser aumentada e enriquecida. Pelas suas palavras, somos levados até onde os investigadores conseguem ir, aprendendo a distinguir com mais detalhe o mais pequeno e como os elementos não apenas existem, como interagem entre si. Segundo a revista New York, Carl Zimmer é o jornalista de ciência mais respeitado do país. Autor de 14 livros sobre ciência, tem atualmente uma coluna semanal no New York Times sobre temas de ciência e antes colaborou também com a National Geographic, a Wired e a Atlantic. O seu trabalho de escrita para a divulgação de ciência já foi muitas vezes premiado e o seu trabalho consta também nas séries The Best American Science Writing, The Best American Science Writing e Nature Writing. Pode ser frequentemente ouvido em programas de rádio como o Radiolab, que é uma referência internacional em podcast de ciência, e é ainda professora adjunta da Universidade de Yale, onde ensina biofísica, molecular e bioquímica, bem como cursos de escrita sobre ciência. E é, até onde sabe, o único escritor que dá nome a uma espécie de ténia. Já para não falar de que a flora microbiana do seu umbigo consta em artigos científicos. Welcome, Carl Zimmer. It's quite a pleasure to be having this conversation with you. I was saying that as far as you know, you're the only author that has given name to a tapeworm, which is obviously something super cool. I would like to also talk about your belly button, making it to the scientific writing. It's something you wrote in 2012 that was very compelling and very beautiful, that drew me into the fabulous world of the human microbiome, which is something very new and very, very, very surprising, that we have bacteria even in our belly buttons.
Yes, we have bacteria everywhere, inside and outside of our bodies. And it's only been in the past 10 or 15 years that it's become possible to catalog the diversity of the microbiome. And I happened to be at a meeting where a scientist was collecting samples from people's belly buttons, because he just wondered, well, how many species of bacteria are there in people's belly buttons? And is one person's biodiversity in their belly button different from another's? So we just took a swab and put it in our belly buttons and gave it to the scientist, and he published a whole paper about it. I have, believe, 58 species of bacteria in my belly button, which may sound like a lot, but there are other people who had over 100 species. There are probably thousands of species of bacteria in our microbiome. There are probably 10, 50 trillion bacteria in each of us. and they are very important for our well-being. They help to keep us healthy.
Yes, and we don't only have bacteria, we also are made of viruses. As you talk about, we have this endogenous retrovirus inside our DNA. Some of us have virus inside of us as well. We don't only carry bacteria, we also carry virus inside of us. Are we walking, talking, transporters for microbiodiversity in the planet?
We are very much a home to little things, to tiny life. And so in addition to bacteria in our bodies, we are home to trillions of viruses. Some of those viruses infect our own cells, but they don't make us sick. Others infect the bacteria that live inside of us. So we have trillions of viruses inside of us, probably tens of thousands of different species in total that can live in us, of viruses. And some of those viruses can insert their genes into our own DNA. And sometimes that viral DNA gets passed down from one generation to the next. And so the human genome has been accumulating viral DNA. There are about 100,000 pieces of our human genome that is virus. It makes up about 8% of the human genome. So we are very much part virus.
And don't they hurt us, having a little bit of virus genome in us? Is that okay? Are we doing okay?
It depends. Viruses have a range of relationships with their hosts. So viruses can be beneficial, or they can be neutral, or they can be harmful. We think always of viruses making us sick, but when we're perfectly healthy, we have trillions of viruses inside of us that are replicating all the time. And when they get into our DNA and become a part of our genome, that can be a source of disease, but it can also be a source of new adaptations. So for disease, it's possible for some of these stretches of viral DNA to suddenly start to make copies of themselves, or to insert those copies in places where they shouldn't be. So these pieces of viral DNA in our genome can help to drive cancer, because certain cells will gain the ability to grow out of control using viral DNA. But evolution has also domesticated some of this viral DNA. So we've actually taken genes from viruses through evolution, and now we use them for our own benefit. Our immune system depends on viral DNA. Our reproduction depends on viral DNA. Early human embryos use viral DNA as they develop. So if you took our viral DNA away from us, we would disappear. We could not survive as a species.
That's very interesting. Another thing that I learned by reading your book is that we only have viruses inside our bodies and in land, but there are also 100 billion types of viruses in the sea, in the water. This was quite astonishing. Should we be afraid of swallowing a little bit of water when we go to have a dive in the sea?
No, we should not be afraid to go in the ocean, but it is full of viruses. And for a long time, scientists thought that the ocean was basically sterile, that salt water was too harsh for something as delicate as a virus to survive in it. That turns out to be very wrong. Viruses have adapted to the ocean. Viruses have probably been in the ocean for billions of years. If you scoop up just a cup of seawater, it contains many billions of viruses. Even a teaspoon will contain billions of viruses. But most of those viruses are infecting the bacteria and other microbes that live in seawater. So much of the seawater in the top layer where sunlight can get in is full of bacteria. And some are reproducing through photosynthesis. They capture the light. And some of the bacteria are predators. They attack the photosynthetic bacteria. And they all are getting infected with viruses. And actually, the viruses are tearing apart the bacteria, and the carbon inside of the bacteria spills out into the ocean. And there's so much of this carbon that the viruses are actually having an influence on the planet's entire carbon cycle. So that when we talk about how much carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere and how that affects the climate, viruses are helping to control that level.
That's very, very interesting. Maybe we can stop a little bit and try to understand what's a virus, because sometimes it's easier to say what it's not. It's not, well, as you wrote in your book, it was, they had difficulty defining what it was, only what it wasn't. It wasn't an animal, it's not a plant, it's not a fungus, it's not a bacteria, it's something else. And then Frederick Twott said it's impossible to define its nature, according to your book. And of course, there's also my favorite one by Peter Medower that says a virus is a piece of bad news wrapped up in protein, which is the most colorful definition of a virus. But it doesn't really help us to understand what is a virus after all.
Well, to think about a virus, it's important to just remind ourselves of what a cell is. So our bodies are made up of cells, plants are made up of cells, bacteria are single cells. And in every case, you're talking about a boundary, a barrier, inside of which there are genes and lots of proteins and RNA molecules that sustain the life of the cell. So they can take in nutrients, they can break them down, they can build new things, they can grow, they can divide. So that's cellular life. Viruses are very different. And so, an influenza virus, for example, is a shell of protein, and inside it are some genes, just a few genes. And that's basically it. So there's no metabolism going on inside the virus. The virus does not eat and grow. It does not harness sunlight. It basically is a vehicle that delivers those viral genes to a cell. It attaches to a cell, fuses to it, delivers the genes, and then the cell uses those genes to make new viruses. So it's a very, very different way of replicating than cellular life like us.
Yeah, so there's also always this conversation about, is a virus alive? Is it life? That can lead us to almost a philosophical discussion about what is life. And I know you're now writing upon that theme because it's really complex and difficult to grasp in just a couple of sentences or even in a tweet.
Yes, I have a new book. In addition to A Planet of Viruses, I have a book that just came out called Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. And there I dive into that question of what do we mean when we use this word life? And scientists have been asking this question, what is life, for centuries, and they've learned a lot about life, but they're still struggling to define it. There are hundreds of definitions of life, and according to some of them, a virus is alive. According to some of them, a virus is not alive. There are even scientists who would argue that viruses are not alive when they're floating around on their own, and then when they go into a cell and take it over, a new kind of life comes into existence. A French scientist named Patrick Forterre calls this a virocell, because this virocell has a new purpose, which is to make new viruses. So the question of what is alive is a wonderful question. It's a mysterious question. It's a question without clear answers right now, but we can learn a lot in struggling with it. And viruses play a key role in that question.
Yes. You were talking about genes, and you mentioned some of the number of genes of some of the viruses that you mentioned in your book. For example, the rhinovirus has 10 genes, influenza 13, the papillomavirus 8, HIV 9, the Nile virus 11, and even the biggest viruses of them all have only a little bit over 1,000. For comparison, in the human protein coding genes, they range from 20,000 to 25,000. So is small beautiful for nature? Is being that small important for their adaptation and their survival in nature?
One of the great lessons of evolution is that there isn't necessarily one way that's better than another way to be making a living. Whenever you look at a group of species, you find an astonishing range of different ways of surviving. You just look at mammals, for example. You have mammals that are predators. You have mammals that are tiny little seed eaters. You have gigantic mammals like giraffes that eat plants. So that doesn't mean that there's one way to be a mammal. And so, viruses, yes, they're very small, physically small. And in terms of their genome is tiny as well. And it's kind of amazing how well something like the influenza virus can get along with so few genes. But that's one strategy. We do pretty well with our strategy of being big cellular life forms with lots and lots of genes. It's not the case that one is better than the other. But it is worth pointing out in the defense of viruses that there are far more viruses than there are any other form of life. Scientists estimate that on Earth, there are 10 to the 31st power viruses. What does that mean? Well, take a number 1 and draw 31 zeros after that. That's how many viruses there are. And that's maybe 10 times more than all the cellular life on Earth, all the bacteria, all the animals, all the plants, and so on. In terms of diversity as well, viruses are incredibly diverse. So every time that scientists look anywhere, they find new species of viruses, and often they're not closely related to any virus we've ever seen before. That includes inside our own body. I mean, there was a study that just came out recently where scientists looked at some blood in people. There was a study by some Spanish researchers, and they found, I believe, 30 entirely new species of viruses in people's blood. Perfectly healthy people. These are not causing diseases, but these are just species we didn't know about before. There might be 1 trillion species of viruses on Earth. So being a virus is a pretty good way of making your way on Earth.
Mm. One of the things that I enjoyed in the book is that you're taking us through stories of different scientists and how they discovered different things. And when I could not stop but think about how the methods and the importance of clinical trials and having robust scientific evidence have grown over time. If you think about Jenner experiences with the cows and the boys and everything, and how we do science nowadays in clinical, there are lots of examples of very interesting clinical trials done throughout the last century or so in your book that are very, very interesting. And yes, that's what I wanted to ask you a little bit about the change of the robustness of the way that we gather the scientific data, because it is also very interesting that we got first vaccines and then we got to know what was happening there.
That's right. So the first vaccines were for smallpox, and originally there was a process in Africa and in China where people would actually receive a little bit of a smallpox blister and be put under their skin, and so they would sort of have a weakened form of the smallpox virus, and the hope was that they could develop immunity without dying of smallpox. Some people did. This was a relatively dangerous way to become immune to smallpox, but it was the only way that people knew of. And then in the 1790s, Edward Jenner, the British physician, had this great idea of saying, well, seems to be a related disease that cows get called cowpox. And women who milk the cows, he noticed, would get smallpox-like blisters on their hands. So he thought, well, maybe this would protect against smallpox. And he basically ran the experiment just on a boy, and it turned out to work. But Jenner was just working in a little English town and with very few people. He was lucky that the results were so clear. Today, we have these vaccine trials for COVID-19 vaccines, and each trial involves 30,000, 40,000 people. And there are all sorts of statistical methods that are built into it, so we can really know whether these vaccines work, and if so, how well they work, and we can also figure out how safe they are. Because if you give a vaccine to 20,000 people, some of them are going to have a heart attack just by coincidence. Now, did that heart attack, was it caused by the vaccine? How do you know? Well, you can get an idea about that by doing a simultaneous experiment, looking at people who get the vaccine versus people who get a placebo instead, and look at the different rates. And so now we have a number of vaccines against COVID-19 that are both safe and effective. And we know that thanks to the trial design.
Yes, trial design is quite important. And yes, and we all know, because we have been experiencing this problem with dealing with the clots, that because it makes the people that are a little bit afraid of vaccines think that maybe there's a reason to be afraid of vaccines. But we need the big numbers to study and to have the trials.
Yeah, well, I mean, when there are very, very rare side effects to a treatment, you won't know about them until a whole lot of people get the treatment. And that's true across the board with all sorts of medicine. Lots of medicines will have very, very rare side effects. So then you need to look at whether, look at the costs and the benefits. So what is the benefit of having a vaccine that will protect you from COVID? Well, the benefits are quite high because we're in the middle of a pandemic. If indeed there are risks of blood clots from one vaccine, we need to find out, are certain people at risk for that? And then we can say, well, okay, those people should get a different vaccine. Simply saying, well, we don't want to do anything is really not an option, because thousands of people are dying every day.
Yes. I was thinking about also on your chapter on rhinoviruses, you say we don't have a cure, we don't have a vaccine. I was thinking that can the overall usage of face masks, we are all using them right now to prevent from COVID, could they have a role in diminishing the rhinoviruses? Could we eradicate rhinoviruses for forbidding them to have a host? Because if they're not passing through people, they don't have a host anymore. Could that be the case? Could the face masks that we are using to prevent COVID have a side effect on rhinoviruses, on influenza, on other viruses?
We certainly are seeing that the face masks are having a huge impact, not just on COVID-19, but on influenza. In the United States, we have been amazed at how low influenza rates are this year. And in terms of deaths in children of influenza, which is, a number of children die every year of influenza in the United States, and hardly any have died this year at all. And that's probably partly due to wearing masks and partly due to various other means to reduce the exposure that people have, whether it's distancing or other means. That's great. There are so many lives that are being saved because of that. But, it can also be disruptive to our lives. I mean, it's not fun to live this way, and no one wants to. I don't think that this could ever eradicate influenza or rhinoviruses that cause the cold, because you would just have to be incredibly thorough with your masking and other measures. You'd have to have every single person wearing a mask, and that mask would have to be absolutely perfect. It takes very few viruses to get from one person to another to start a new chain of transmission. We've only successfully eradicated a single human virus, smallpox, and that had a lot to do with the special way in which smallpox infects people. It only infects people, not any other species. You can isolate people very quickly when they get sick. Vaccines are very effective. So a whole combination of these efforts was able to lead to the eradication of smallpox in the 1970s. Influenza, COVID, rhinoviruses, they're not going to be eradicated that way, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yeah. Another virus that you talk about in your book is, of course, HIV. It's a very interesting virus for many perspectives. But it's very interesting to make the comparison between AIDS in the 80s and COVID in the 2020s, because how fast it was right now to understand so much more of the virus than it was back then. It was so hard. And nowadays we now have a lot of medication, a lot of the PrEP, many things we can do, but we still lack the vaccine for HIV. Could the mRNA vaccine that has been developed for COVID be a window of opportunity to finally have a vaccine against HIV?
I'm sure that there will be scientists who will be trying out the new mRNA vaccines for HIV, but that might help. But there's a deeper challenge that scientists have to reckon with, which is that HIV is just very, very hard for our immune system to control. The molecular shape of the proteins that cover its surface are just very difficult for antibodies to attach to and then effectively stop the virus. In addition, HIV has an enormous variety of forms. And so even if you make a vaccine that's effective against one version of HIV, there will be other versions that will be able to spread and not be stopped by your vaccine. So scientists started making vaccines in the 1980s for HIV, and they have not found one yet that is actually effective. So we're looking at over 30 years of efforts that have not led to anything yet. So mRNA vaccines will probably help scientists to develop new kinds of vaccines, go after new targets on HIV. But what we need and what scientists are currently doing is getting a deeper understanding of HIV itself. So there may be a few very special targets on the virus that if we can point our immune system to these particular tiny targets, that could be the Achilles heel for HIV. It's also very interesting to think about that. Well, in a different scale, but we dealt with HIV worldwide, and we have learned a lot about public health and viruses. What have we learned from HIV that can help us face COVID-19 right now? That we have learned
how to talk with people and because it's not just about the science, it's not just about the health issue, it's also about getting people on board to help us fight the pandemic. So what have we learned from HIV that could help us with COVID?
Well, there are lessons to be learned from HIV. I'm not sure that we have really been paying attention. Certainly an effective way to reduce rates of HIV is for doctors and public health organizations to talk about how our behavior enables the virus to spread. So if people understand how HIV is spread through sex, through drug use, through other ways, then it's possible to change behavior to reduce the rate of transmission. We know with COVID that there are ways we can change our behavior to reduce the rate of transmission, but people in the United States and in Europe often just don't want to do it. They would prefer that not to be what they have to do, so they don't do it. And so, we'll have people walking around the United States who have a mask on, but it's hanging down on their chin, and I don't understand. If you've learned about how the virus spreads, you should know that it needs to be over your nose and your mouth. So HIV did give us many lessons. It also taught us the importance of robust public health systems, not just in wealthy countries, but around the world, and how that can drive down the global transmission. Those are still important for COVID as well. And we need to remember those lessons.
You also, in your book, you also go into the Nile virus and, of course, chikungunya and Zika. And I was thinking as well, as climate change progresses and the climate getting warmer, should we prepare that the next pandemic come from a mosquito-borne virus? Could that be?
Much of the world already has to deal with mosquito-borne viruses. Dengue virus, for example, is a great burden on a number of countries. And so we're already in a world where mosquito-borne viruses are a big problem. Climate change can potentially expand the ranges for some of these viruses. Partly because the mosquitoes are going to be more comfortable in places where it was too cold for them before. There may be other ways in which climate change will encourage the spread of these diseases. And so, one of the many, many reasons that we need to stop climate change is for our own health.
Now, I was also thinking that there's mostly in Europe and the United States, we do not study African diseases. We don't have so many lines of financing for scientists to study that kind of disease. And with climate change, they will increase. And I was thinking also that with COVID, one of the things that was so important was that research that was being made on fundamental science, not because we didn't know that we were going to have COVID, but the importance of the investment in fundamental science and in things that we don't even know that are going to happen to help us deal with emergent problems.
Yes, science works best when scientists are exploring the world around us without being forced to answer very narrow questions. And part of that is because you don't know what the problem is going to be, next year or in 100 years. So when scientists first started to think about the danger that emerging viruses could pose, they were very concerned, first of all, by HIV, and then also influenza. So there was a concern that there would be a pandemic influenza that would emerge from a bird influenza, much as what happened in 1918. And so there was a lot of work in preparation for that. It turns out that right now we're not dealing with an influenza pandemic. We're dealing with a pandemic of a coronavirus. you know, up until maybe 20 years ago, no one thought about coronaviruses as being something that causes a pandemic. They were just known as something that causes a cold. And then we had SARS in the early 2000s, which was caused by another coronavirus, and that made people wake up to the potential for coronaviruses to be a threat. And so a number of scientists started studying coronaviruses and just getting to know their basic biology. And that work on just getting to know the basic biology of coronaviruses is what made these vaccines possible. Because scientists figure out, well, what is the target on the virus? How do we stop this thing? How does it get into our cells? That knowledge, which came years and years and years before this pandemic, is now saving millions of lives.
I really enjoyed that you named your chapter on COVID, why COVID-19 should not be a surprise, which I really enjoyed as a title. So I remember when it started, some people were pointing out lectures or books. Well, someone has a wizard or a crystal ball and thought of it. It was not, you don't have to be a wizard or have a crystal ball to not be surprised by COVID-19, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, there were a lot of politicians, especially, would say, no one could have predicted this would happen. This is so amazing. And I feel like that was a way for some politicians to try to avoid responsibility for dealing with the pandemic. Because the fact is that since the 1990s, in other words, for some 30 years, scientists have been warning that emerging viruses spilling over from animals could potentially cause global pandemics and that we needed to prepare for them. And coronaviruses have been clearly a concern for 20 years since SARS. Because once SARS was discovered, people said, where did it come from? Well, the virus came from bats. So scientists said, well, how many other coronaviruses are in bats? And they went and they looked, and they found a lot of coronaviruses in bats. They keep finding new ones. And then in 2015, another coronavirus spilled over from bats into camels and then could start infecting people in the Middle East. This came to cause a disease called MERS. So then we had two spillover coronaviruses. So for anyone to be surprised that a coronavirus spilled over again from another bat is just willfully ignoring years of research and understanding.
I was also wondering, do you think maybe it's because science usually has good media? Usually science goes out into the television or in the radio or whatever, giving us good news. So maybe people don't want to hear when science gives them bad news or gives them uncertainty. Maybe what we've seen with COVID is that people were especially in the beginning, they were really put off every time that scientists said, we don't know. So this was putting people off.
It's true. I think sometimes people feel that science is about absolute truth, and that scientists immediately discover everything that's true and then tell us, and that's that. And the fact is that science is an ongoing process of discovery. Sometimes you discover that you were wrong, and then you update your understanding. And sometimes there's a threat that you're not even aware of until it is threatening you. So sometimes it is difficult for people to take in scientific information when there's uncertainty involved. It's easy to dismiss it. So if scientists say there is a threat in the future of an emerging virus, and I can't tell you exactly which one it's going to be, and I can't tell you exactly when it's going to happen, people can say, well, I have other things I have to deal with. We're going to deal with other social issues or what have you. And I don't mean to diminish the importance of other issues that politicians have to deal with, but when scientists are telling you for years and years and years that there is this threat, and we know that it has the potential to kill millions or tens of millions of people worldwide, you have to reckon with it. So now politicians are starting to look forward about, well, what about the next pandemic? Which is, I'm glad they're thinking that way, but it's too bad that we weren't better prepared for this one.
Mm. And how do you think we can be better prepared, be it for the pandemic? And I'm also thinking about climate change and so many things. Do we need more science advisory boards for governments, or do we need politicians to be already wanting to hear about science?
Well, if the politicians don't listen to the science, then we're in big trouble. And what the science has to tell us, there are a few key lessons. So one thing is that human health is very much dependent on the health of ecosystems. So if we are disturbing large areas of rainforest and fragmenting it, and we are going to be coming into contact more and more with bats and other animals that harbor viruses that could spill over into our species. So that's one of many reasons that we need to work on preserving the intact ecosystems that are still with us. Another thing to do is to be better aware of what viruses are in those animals that could potentially spill over. We need a better surveillance system so that as soon as some people start getting infected with a virus, and maybe at that point it's just a harmless dead end, we need to know that that's happening so we can intervene quickly to not allow it to take off. And finally, there's a lot that can be done in the area of medicine in terms of vaccines and antiviral drugs. There's really fascinating research that's being supported now for vaccines that might work against not just one coronavirus, but maybe all coronaviruses. There might be antivirals that don't just work against one virus infection, but all coronavirus infections, for example. So all that, that will cost money, but you have to remember that this one virus has probably caused 10, 20, 30 trillion dollars of various kinds of damage to the world at large. So even spending $100 billion to protect ourselves from the next one is money very well spent.
Thank you. We are almost finishing now, but I'd like to ask you a final question. You have a science column for many years, and now you have it in a general newspaper. And I was wondering, but since we don't have that much science in general newspapers here, I would like you to help us on the importance for promoting scientific culture of having a science column in everyday newspaper, on the importance of talking about science to people.
Well, I'm very grateful to be able to write for a newspaper like the New York Times, which has 20 or 30 full-time writers on science and medicine. And so it's great to be a part of that team. We publish stories every day. We have a section every Tuesday called Science Times. It's just dedicated to science. And I think it's important in all sorts of ways. I mean, it's important to show how, most of the major problems that we are facing as a society are, in one way or another, scientific problems. And also science just gives us a way to appreciate the world that we're a part of and give us a sense of awe at the universe, at our own evolution, at deep questions about existence. So I think that everybody should be able to have access to that kind of information in whatever language.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. It was a pleasure to read about viruses in your book that's coming out here in Portugal. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Muito obrigada a todos aqueles que nos estiveram a seguir. Esta conversa ficará aqui disponível. Voltamos para a semana, dia 15 de abril, às 21 horas, com Sean B. Carroll, sobre o seu livro, uma série de felizes coincidências. Obrigada!